Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live Q&A on clinical trials for progressive MS. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with Sean and Ailsa today and answering the questions we received from you. And just to introduce myself, my name is Laura. I'm a research communications officer here at the MS Society. And today, as I mentioned, I'm joined by Sean and Elsa. Do you both just want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Sean. I'm one of the neurology and trials doctors working with Professor Chataway on the Octopus trial at the moment.
Yeah, and I'm Elsa, and I'm on the Octopus trial.
Fantastic, thank you. And just before we kick things off, I just want to quickly mention we won't be able to answer any medical questions or give any medical advice on our live stream today, but we do have our MS nurses on our MS helpline, and they can give you medical information on things like treatment options, side effects of medication, and managing symptoms. So if you would like any help or advice, you can reach them on our MS helpline under 0808 800 8000, or you can reach them via email at helpline@mssociety.org.uk. But we'll also share some more resources and links at the end of our live session. And also just to kind of introduce the MS Society, we fund and co-fund a number of pioneering clinical trials, both for primary and secondary progressive MS. And these include, for example, the MS-STAT2 trial, which is testing a common cholesterol-lowering statin for secondary progressive MS. But we also have the Chariot MS trial, which is testing an existing DMT, which is called cladribine, and it's testing this for advanced MS. And then lastly, we have the Octopus trial, which is currently testing two repurposed drugs, both for primary and secondary progressive MS. And as I mentioned earlier, we received a lot of questions from the MS community for Sean and Elsa about clinical trials for progressive MS. But before we jump into that, Sean, could you tell us a bit about the clinical trials you are currently working on for people with progressive MS?
Sure. Thank you, Laura. So the two trials that I'm working on over through UCLH are the MS-STAT2 trial and the Octopus trial. I'll start off with the STAT2 trial just because it's been going on for longer. So that's been up for a number of years, and it's due to be completing round about the middle of next year. It's specifically looking at simvastatin, which is very commonly used as a cholesterol-lowering drug across the UK, to see whether or not it can benefit people with secondary progressive MS. And the other trial is the Octopus trial, which is a very novel type of trial in and of itself, because, well, we can elaborate on that later, but essentially it allows us to test multiple drugs simultaneously and to potentially add drugs or drop them off as the trial progresses in a more fluid way to make it more efficient in the long term compared to regular clinical trials. And for that one, we're testing two other drugs, both of them repurposed. One is metformin, which we think might be good at promoting myelin repair or remyelination. And the other one is lipoic acid or alpha lipoic acid, which we think could be beneficial for neuroprotection. So it's a potent antioxidant, and we think that it can protect the neurons themselves. Ultimately, the goal of all of these trials is to see if we can slow down the rate of progression of things getting worse in progressive types of MS. So I think it's useful to think about these and why some people like to come onto trials, or why they at least consider it. And obviously there's no one size fits all, everyone has their own reasons. But the things that people quite consistently say is that it gives them the feeling that they're contributing to the overall picture, the research, the possibility of us finding treatments and cures going forward. Another aspect is that there's a specific team, obviously, involved in every clinical trial who would be following up an individual's case. Very frequently, there are additional investigations like MRI scans. So it's like you have an additional team overlooking things in addition to your regular NHS team. So there's someone else that you can bounce questions off of that might be a little bit more available as well. In terms of what's involved for each of these trials, so for ours, I can say that we focus primarily on MRI scans and clinical assessments. Clinical assessments are crucial in terms of deciphering whether or not you think that the medication is having an effect. And the MRI scans are very useful in giving us an indication as to whether or not those things are going to be useful in the future. We don't use them exclusively, so sometimes we might have a point in a trial where we're not relying on the MRI scans, like Octopus, for example. In the second half of assessing any individual drug, MRI scans would not feature into it. But for the first part, when we're trying to find a signal as to how effective a drug is, the MRI is quite crucial in giving us that go-ahead or early stopping signal that we would be looking for. And lastly, why is it necessary to take part in trials? And I think that ties in with what I said before about people's interest in joining trials, which is that we need them to identify treatments. We don't know what is or isn't effective, and we can do a lot of early phase evaluations, testing things on computer models, animal models. But at the end of the day, the only real way to know whether or not a drug is going to be benefiting people with different types of MS is to go ahead with a clinical trial.
Fantastic. That's super interesting. Thank you, Sean. And I see you both also have the little orange octopus in the background. So, Ailsa, I know you were one of the first participants to actually join that clinical trial. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what your experience so far have been.
Yeah, I've got my octopus, not quite as well displayed as Sean, but there it is. So I joined the clinical trial for Octopus at the beginning of April. And my experience, it has been, like Sean said, it does feel good to be part of part of the bigger picture, but also for me right now, I was diagnosed, my MS change to secondary progressive MS probably in October 22. So for me right now, the best thing I can do for myself is to be on a trial, because like Sean said, you get the extra input from medical people, and also that positive feeling that you're contributing to finding treatments for progressive MS, which is what we need. And, the placebo effect's a real thing. So if you did happen to be in one of those rather than the two drugs, then that's also a positive. And I think it's very clear what you need to do, and they've got great communications. So coming in and going to your appointment, and there's like 2 or 3 at the beginning, and then it goes to once every 6 months. So although it's a bit appointment heavy at the beginning, then it's going to be every 6 months, and you can do some of them by phone as well. So I would say it's not been onerous joining in, and it's been a positive experience.
Oh, thank you.
I thought I'd show you as well. I was like, this is the tub of medication that you'll take away with you if you join up to the Octopus, or I'm sure the similar thing for other trials.
So thank you so much for sharing your experience. I'd say now maybe we can jump into the questions that we've gotten from the community. And the first question I would want to direct to Sean, which is, can you only take part in clinical trials if you live near London?
No, so it depends on the clinical trial, but the majority of them, and certainly the larger ones like ours, they would be working across multiple sites across the UK. So maybe not every site would be up and running simultaneously. For example, Octopus began earlier this year, so we're in the process of rolling out additional sites as time goes on. But the goal would always be to try get a very good spread across as much of the United Kingdom as possible, so that people from all the different regions and devolved nations would be able to take part. But again, obviously this takes a little bit of time to get there, but we do. And also moving forward, the idea would be that we can try bring on more trial sites than we have now. So it should continue to expand as time goes on.
Fantastic. I think one example I actually wanted to mention, I think it was last week or the week before, actually an Octopus site just opened in Cardiff. So that might be interesting for any listeners we might have in Wales at the moment. And that leads me to my second question. It's a question from someone who has secondary progressive MS and is using a wheelchair. And they are asking, can I still take part in a clinical trial?
Absolutely. So obviously it depends, again, on the type of clinical trial. They'll each have their own criteria. But for our ones, so Octopus, for example, we rely on something called the EDSS as part of the criteria to see whether or not someone can join into a trial. And classically, this has been a little bit limited in the sense that if someone is entirely reliant on a wheelchair, then they may not be able to take part. But that's not the case with our trials. The EDSS is quite a lot more expanded. So if you're able to stand, for example, that's perfectly fine. And even if not, then there are additional tests that we would be able to use as part of the trial to see if it's having an effect. So no, being in a wheelchair, being wheelchair dependent, that wouldn't be a barrier to taking part in our trials.
Are there any risks from taking part in clinical trials for a person living with progressive MS?
So with any of these, we are testing different drugs. Now, some of them, like the trials that we're running, they're a relatively known entity. They've been around for a very long time. So let's take, for example, simvastatin, metformin, lipoic acid, which our trials look at. They've been around for a very long time. They've been investigated in a number of other trials. So there's a lot of evidence about what their side effect profile can be, what you might run into going forward with them. So that's really well known. Now, obviously, there are other trials in which this is more of an unknown quantity. There's always a big effort to finding out early on, what side effects they might predispose someone to, what could crop up. But part of the trial intrinsically is also safety monitoring. So let's take, for example, in our cases, we do regular blood screening tests. We would do urine dip tests, things like that, where if we have any suspicion that there's any possible side effect that someone could encounter, then we try to pick it up as early as possible so that we can get on top of it. I would say, thinking about Octopus, for example, that they're very well known. The drugs are generally very well tolerated, but it's impossible to say that someone couldn't develop a side effect from them. But that's why we keep such a close eye on things going forward in these kinds of trials.
Thank you, Sean. And we mentioned earlier that there's a whole lot of different trials going on at the moment. And the question we received is, can I take part in more than one trial, for example, Octopus and SHARE-8MS at the same time?
So unfortunately not. And that's because these trials are looking at, the same thing. Does their drug make a difference? And if, for example, you had to be taking part in the Chariot trial, being on cladribine, and then you also joined into the Octopus trial and we started you on something else, well, we wouldn't really know what is benefiting or not benefiting that person or what side effects they're getting as a result of it. So you do have to join one trial and unfortunately stay with that one trial for anyone to be able to meaningfully say whether or not something is benefiting you. And also, I think the other thing to consider is that, with a lot of trials, we are trying different medications that we're not 100% sure about what they're going to do for the individual. And if you're taking two of them at a given time, that might also complicate matters in and of itself.
Thank you. And then my next question is about placebo. So Elsa mentioned already that she doesn't know if she's currently on the placebo or the treatment. So who decides who gets a placebo? So that's a dummy drug, or who gets the treatment in a trial?
So none of us will actually know who's taking the placebo, who's taking the actual drug that's being treated. So the people that any person taking part in the trial meet on a day-to-day basis, the doctors, the nurses, any of the other staff, we wouldn't have a clue. We're all blinded to the treatment as part of the design of the trial. Again, for the same reason of if we don't know, then we can't have any preconceived ideas as to whether or not it's doing or not doing anything. And it means that the result is a lot more reliable. The only part of the system that would have some ability to find out is the inherent backward machinery of the trial that's organized by the clinical trials unit in our case. And once a person joins onto a trial and are going to be allocated to one of the treatments, then we feed their details into the machine and the machine will tell us they are getting drug X, but we wouldn't know what that is. But essentially there's this machinery in the background that runs and decides who gets allocated to which treatment. But it is in a random fashion.
Interesting. So when someone completes the trial, would they find out at the end if they were on placebo treatment, or is it going to be a mystery forever?
No, not forever, not forever. So, it is all very cleanly recorded who's on what. And once the trial concludes, then the data is unblinded so that us, the trial team, would be able to analyze it, but also so that we can tell people who are taking part in the trial what they were on.
Fantastic. And then probably a lot of our listeners are familiar with how long it can take for clinical trials to come to an end and to take on. So could you explain to us why it actually takes for so long for clinical trials to go on?
Sure. So for thinking specifically about clinical trials in progressive MS, it's because we're trying to assess something which is a little bit harder to define in a really tangible way. So I'm sure any listeners here who have progressive MS appreciate that, things change and they would be very aware of the changes that they themselves are experiencing. But it doesn't tend to be something that happens really suddenly and really dramatically. It tends to be more of a gradual process. And for our trials, our assessments, the things that we can do to pick up these changes, they're pretty subtle. And obviously the tests that we have are not as good as the individual's experience, but that's the most reliable way that we can say whether or not a drug is having an effect. So you end up having to monitor a lot of people for a long period of time, for years, to see whether or not their condition is progressing at the same way that we know that it generally does, and that if you're on placebo, it keeps on doing. Or if you're in the treatment, is it not progressing or progressing much more slowly? And therefore that gives you that signal to say, all right, this is likely doing something. But in order to get there, you do need to keep, assessing people over a period of years to see if you can reliably disentangle that difference.
A question that's somewhat connected to this, which is when will we actually know the results of these trials? And then once we do know the results, what are the next steps if a drug is actually effective?
Sure. So for MS-STAT2, so we've completed recruitment. Everyone who was going to be on board is on board. And we're going to keep on following people up until around the middle of next year. So our final assessment should be around that time in 2024. And then after that, obviously, there'll be a period when we need to go over the data, see that it's all hunky-dory, and then we can proceed with analyzing it and bringing out a result. And we think that the results should be available by early 2025. So that would be around about the time frame that we would expect to be able to say how effective that was. For Octopus, it's broken up into multiple stages. I think, like I had alluded to before, the first part of the trial is using MRI scans primarily to say whether or not we think one of the medications is effective. So that would be about 18 months for every individual that joins onto the trial, because MRI scans are a big part at this point, and you'd have to have a scan at the beginning, 6, 12, and 18 months later. So that's a year and a half. So we would need to wait for a year and a half until after the last person comes on. So roughly speaking, that should be about 2027 that first phase is completed, and that we would be able to start getting some results from it. But the trial itself would keep on going. That's the advantage over the other ones. It's not like we need to stop it and then start again afterwards. It just carries on. So while it is still a long trial, it is still faster than most other trials, than traditional trials.
Fantastic, thank you. And then I'm sure a lot of listeners are also aware that there's often very stringent eligibility criteria for clinical trials. Could you tell us more about why clinical trials do need to have these eligibility criteria?
Yeah, of course. I appreciate the frustration that comes with them, but this goes back to the level of disability that someone has, I was talking about before, where basically for these trials, we have to see that someone, for example, has a progressive type of MS in order to join in, or that they don't have certain conditions that we know could be riskier in terms of the side effect profile that we were talking about before. Mostly it's a matter of making sure that the people that come into the trial, we can be sure that things are changing for them, and that we can pick up a reliable signal to tell us if the drug is effective. Because if we didn't have eligibility criteria, then we wouldn't have a reliable outcome at the end, and we still wouldn't be able to say whether or not the drug was effective.
Fantastic, Sean. Now I've got the last question for you, Sean, which is, how could I get about getting involved in a trial?
So it depends on the trial. So for Octopus, there is a registration of interest portal, which is just a web page that the MS Society has hosted on their website. And it's just a matter of clicking onto that link, providing your details. It's a very, very quick set of questions, which maybe altogether would take less than 5 minutes. And that will automatically say whether or not broadly a person can take part in the trial, and then we would go ahead and contact that person in due course. For other trials, it could be a matter of talking to your neurologist or a member of your neurology team, and then making a referral on to the the trial itself directly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sean. Ailsa, would you be able to tell us a bit about how you actually found out about the Octopus trial?
Yeah, my husband gets the MS Society newsletter, and a while ago it came through and it had details of this future Octopus trial. And so we talked about it, but I said, yes, I'd like to sign up, but could he put his email down? Because I didn't want to be flooded with lots of information if something wasn't going to happen. So one day he came in, he said, I've had an email and it's from Sean. And so then we had a phone call, and then that's how it started. So yeah, I think putting the information getting the information from the MS Society, and then putting your details in, and then it will start. That's how it started for me.
Thank you, Elsa. And now I have another question for you about someone who wants to know more about your experience on the trial. And the question is, I have progressive MS and I want to get involved in a trial, but I don't know if it will be right for me. So what is your advice you would give to someone who isn't quite sure?
Yeah, so I think, well, the first thing I would say is put your name down, because when it comes up, you will then be having access to the really expert people to talk about anything that you're worried about or any concerns you might have, because that then gives you access to those experts and the people who are designing and behind the trial. So they'll be able to answer any questions you have about why it might not be right for you. And then I think getting involved, it means, it's what we all need with progressive MS, because we need more successful treatments. So even if you're feeling nervous, it might not be right for you. Once you start the process, I think the teams and the people that you meet and how things have been made to suit someone with MS, you'll find that you're well cared for and that it will be a positive experience.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we have a little bit of time for maybe one last question. I think Sean and Elsa, maybe both of you could let me know what you think and what your insight is. So what kind of tests are actually involved in Octopus? So what could like a trial site visit actually look like? I don't know. Sean, do you want to go first maybe?
Sure. So from, let's say from the Octopus side, so an MRI scan is an intrinsic part of the trial at this point. So they are a little bit lengthier. So for example, the average MRI scan should last about 45 minutes. It's only a scan of the head, not the whole spine, because I know that some people are concerned, for example, about, claustrophobia and the noisiness of it, etc. But that tends to make things a lot more comfortable because it's not the whole scan that you're having to go into. And the other aspects are clinical assessments. So one would be a full neurology exam, like I'm sure that most people are accustomed to from their clinical experience. And otherwise quite an assessment of people's walking. So we would have an area that is free of clutter, quite flat, and we'd want to see how long a person can comfortably walk for before they would need to have a break. And related to that would be a walking assessment to see how quickly someone can walk from one point to another point, that being 25 feet. And they would do that twice. And the last aspects would be a test of people's hand function, so their dexterity, where you would have a series of pegs, a series of holes, and having to put the pegs into the holes and then back into the collecting tray. And another one is just a very quick test of vision, just to see how well people can see letters when they become progressively more and more faded. So altogether, let's say the clinical assessment side might take about 30 to 45 minutes. And the MRI side, again, that is 45 minutes pretty much for a regular MRI.
Thank you. And Elsa, obviously you've already, yeah, I was about to ask, yeah.
Well, just as a participant, I think you're going to turn up and you're going to be led through all the different things by the research fellows and the other people involved, and that you are going to be guided through every stage. And then ultimately, for the Octopus trial, you're then going to finish your appointment and take home the medication and get into the routine of taking one in the morning, one in the evening, and then after a month you'll then go onto the higher dose, which means 2 pills in the morning, 2 pills in the evening, and you just have to get into that routine, taken with food and water, so it's quite easy, and then wait to get your text messages or your appointments from the team and follow as instructed.
Thank you so much for sharing.
So, because it occurred to me as well, I suppose one other thing to tag in with the test side. I think I mentioned before, obviously, we do blood tests as well. So there would be some tests that we would do in clinic, like the bloods and the urine test as well for safety. And there is an element that we're able to have people do at home. So we would give testing strips so that people wouldn't necessarily need to come back to us again for some of the more minor investigations. We would be able to do them remotely as well.
It's quite streamlined already.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, Sean, you already mentioned which treatments are currently being tested for Octopus. Could you just tell us a bit more about them?
Sure. So starting off, let's say, with metformin. So that is kind of the way of looking at it is that it's the working horse of diabetes management. It's been around since about the 1940s, so it's very familiar. And what it does normally is that it just lowers people's blood sugar levels by a number of different mechanisms. There's been a lot of research looking at it in animal models, cell models, where we're able to test it and its effect on the cells that are really responsible for building and maintaining the myelin that's around sheaths. Because, as we know from MS, one of the main issues is with demyelination, with damage to those nerve cells. And the important thing in progressive MS is how best to encourage its recovery and its maintenance. So there's a lot of encouraging signal on that side from metformin. With lipoic acid, it has a whole host of different potential mechanisms, but probably the most important one that we can find is that it's a really potent antioxidant. And that's been seen in, again, a number of preclinical assessments and investigations, as well as a smaller clinical trial that took place maybe 2 years ago, which again looked quite promising, which is why we wanted to bring it forward in Octopus. And essentially, we think that antioxidant capacity is what gives it the ability to really protect neurons when they're in that place of stress as a result of the historic MS or their active progressive or secondary progressive MS. And that it's able to give them that added stability, that added bit of support so that they can keep on going.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This brings us to the end of our live stream, actually. So thank you so much, Sean and Elsa. That was so interesting. I've definitely learned loads. And also thank you to everyone who's joined us for our live Q&A today. If you'd like to find out more about clinical trials for progressive MS, we've popped some links into the chat that you can check out. Or if you want to watch the Q&A back and look at it again, it'll be on our Facebook page and also on YouTube. So thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.